Welcome everyone to the webinar, Global Terrorism, a focus on the Sahel region. Thank you very much for connecting with us this afternoon. We will be discussing the trends in global terrorism and take a deeper look at the Sahel region. To do that, we have gathered an excellent set of speakers with us, including Serge Strobans, Director of Europe and MENA region at the Institute for Economics and Peace, Dr. Pierre Englebert, H. Russell Smith Professor of International Relations at Pomona College and Senior Fellow at Africa Central Atlantic Council, and also Dr. Mustafa Resrasi, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Thank you very much to all our speakers today for joining us well, and also to the Institute for Economics and Peace and the Policy Center for the New South for hosting this webinar today. Thank you for connecting from social media channels, and please feel free to send a question to any of our speakers at any time via the comment section. The team will make sure to send the questions over to our speakers, and we will do our best to reply to them at the end of the session. First, we will begin with the presentation of the Global Terrorism Index by Serge Strobans. He will provide us a deeper look into the landscape of global terrorism and the latest trends. Mr. Strobans is the Director of Europe and MENA region at the Institute for Economics and Peace, and he is specialized in political science, security and defense, counterterrorism, global risk analysis, and crisis management. Strobans based his expertise on 30 years of experience in the security and defense domain, underpinned by an extensive academic background with degrees from the Belgian Royal Military Academy, the Free University of Brussels, the German General Staff College, and the Vesalius College. In addition to that, Mr. Strobans is a distinguished visiting professor at the Vesalius College, Blanquerna University, and the Riga Graduate School of Law. Thank you very much for joining us today, Serge, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much to the Policy Center of the New South for co-organizing this webinar, this event with us. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel, and I'm also really pleased to start the presentations for today. And I'm going to share my screen to do so. So I'm going to talk today about the Global Terrorism Index 2020. Headquarters in Sydney, Australia, and several regional offices in New York, pretty close to the UN, of course, Brussels, capital of Europe, close to the EU, NATO, and other European capitals, having also international organizations represented there. My colleague in the is linked to the office in New York. We there have representation because annually we produce also a national peace index for Mexico that is ranking the 32 Mexican states according to the levels of peacefulness. In Africa, we do have an office in Southern Africa, in Harare, in Zimbabwe. So first of all, what is the Global Terrorism Index that is going to give, I would say, the broader picture to the discussion for today? This is the 8th edition of the Global Terrorism Index, and terrorism is one of the 23 indicators that we are using for our Global Peace Index. And we have seen that in the past decade, this was the most volatile and also the most impactful indicator in the Global Peace Index. We have 163 countries on the ranking, which is about or pretty close to 100% of the world population. We developed this ourselves, and we use the START Global Terrorist Database from the University of Maryland to produce this Global Terrorism Index. So we start with the definition of the Global Terrorist Database, definition that is used also to collect the data. We press it through a filter of 4 indicators with a different weight to each indicators, because we understand the psychological effect of terrorism also. We keep half of the impact per year over a period of 5 years within the ranking of the Global Terrorism Index. Of course, we do our job as statisticians to create an index, and we also compare this to socio-economic indicators and other databases that we use at the Institute for Economics and Peace to finally produce a Global Terrorism Index each year. So the results of this year, and let's go straight to business here. So 3 main takeaways. The first main takeaway is the continued decrease of the impact of terrorism over the past 5 years. So since the peak in 2014, we have seen a decrease of almost 60% in the number of casualties by terrorism in the past 5 years. Last year, 15% less. So this is the Global Terrorism Index 2020, concentrating on the data of 2019 and early data of 2020. 2019, less than 4,000 casualties. So that's a continued trend since the peak of the impact in 2014. We also seen that for Islamic State, the core activities, or at least the impact produced by the core, has diminished to less than 1,000 deaths produced last year. So this is the first time since the creation of the Islamic State that we have such a low number, under 1,000 casualties. The second main takeaway would be about another form of terrorism, which would be far-right terrorism. And there we see an increase over the past 5 years of 250% of this phenomenon. Of course, 89 casualties last year. This is really marginal in figures compared to the overall figures of terrorism globally, but it is this steep increase of the impact of this phenomenon on which we need to keep an eye. We have seen that the 4 most impacted countries, so Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Nigeria, all see better results this year than the year before. So that's very good news, but I will also give you some comments, for example, on the figures for Nigeria that, of course, are decreasing, but we see other phenomena rising in this country. What we also see, and that's the third shift or third main takeaway for the results of the Global Terrorism Index 2020, and that is, of course, of interest for the Sahel region, we see that the center of gravity of the Islamic State shifted from the Middle East and Northern Africa towards Sub-Saharan Africa. In the ranking of the 10 largest increase in the impact of terrorism of last year, you will see later on that 7 come from Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, with a concentration, at least with multiple countries located in the Sahel region. And we have seen that the Islamic State was still able last year to impact 27 countries with their attacks or some form of attacks. So this is the top 10 of the Global Terrorism Index 2020, the countries most impacted by terrorism. So you don't see a lot of change there. Clearly, countries that are impacted by conflict for most of them. So now if we continue, and if we look at the difference between 2018 and 2019, we clearly see this decrease in the 3 regions most impacted, but we also see that some countries and some parts of those regions, and of course, here you see a concentration of more figures about the Sahel. We have examples of countries who are going against the mainstream trend of reduced impact of terrorism. We have the example of Mali going from 444 to 592, but we also have this example of Burkina Faso really going from 86 to close to 600. So clearly 2 countries that are going against the stream of a decreased impact. This is the list of the countries having the most casualties. Afghanistan is still accounting for almost half of all casualties, 41%. But please have a look at all the other countries, and you will clearly start to see a new concentration of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. I will now make the case about Nigeria later on when I will talk about Boko Haram and show you those slides. So this is a very good slide, I would say, that is, of course, driving this decrease in the impact of terrorism in the past year. Afghanistan, Nigeria, Iraq, the top 4 all saw a decrease in the number of casualties, the number of deaths in the past year. And that is I would say, quite good news. Of course, you can go into more details for all of these countries and have a look at the reasons for this decrease. Those reasons can be political, but it can also be operational, as you will see the case of Nigeria later on. We also see that those countries are the countries where we saw the largest increase in the past year. So out of those 10, you can almost take out Sri Lanka and New Zealand, because this is the impact of one day of terror. Of course, the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand and the Easter attacks in Colombo and other parts of Sri Lanka. So this is really like one main event on one day. So from the remaining 8 countries that you will see with the largest increase in the impact of terrorism, we see that 7 come from Sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, several of them coming out of the Sahel region. For each of the indexes that we produce, we always produce an estimation of the cost of the violence that we are analyzing. So in this case, the estimation that we produce, of course, based on our indicators and GDP losses, is about $26 billion only by terrorism in 2019. One of the figures that is really interesting, or I would say striking on this slide also, is the percentage of GDP dedicated to countering terrorism, or to at least absorbing the impact of terrorism in Afghanistan, and that is close to 17%. So only for terrorism, we have an impact of close to 17% of the GDP in Afghanistan. In the past year, we have also produced for UNDP Africa an analysis of or an estimation of the cost of violence for 18 African countries. So UNDP Africa, 18 African countries, where we looked, of course, at the legal economy, but also the extra or the non-legal economy, the official and non-official economy. And for most of those countries, when affected by violent extremism, we came to the conclusion that close to between 30 and 40% of the GDP would be dedicated to countering violence or to absorbing the impact of different forms of violence. So just imagine what this, I would say, what this implicates for countries affected by this evil. So if you open the time window to a larger portion of time, you will clearly see the peak in 2014. Why 2014? Well, I would say 2 major events. The creation of the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin, and of course the efforts of the Nigerian defense forces in northeast Nigeria to counter, or to at least address, the threat of Boko Haram, but also the creation of the coalition against Daesh in the Middle East. And so a peak there, a decrease over the past 5 to 6 years, continued almost 60%. And what you also see is a redistribution between the different countries affected, or the different regions affected. And I will show that in the following slides. This is a focus on the different or the largest international terrorist groups and their impact over the years. So there again, you see I would say the peak in 2014, and then the decrease afterwards. This is a time for me to make my case about Nigeria. And when you look at Boko Haram between 2018 and 2019, you will see an increase in the impact of Boko Haram. So when you look at Nigeria, you have a decrease of 30% in the impact of terrorism, and which is good news. But this is mostly driven by a lower level of activity of Fulani groups, who sometimes refer or use this violent form of violence that is terrorism. So this driver, the 30% down, is due to the Fulani groups. On the other hand, we have witnessed in 2019 and continued in 2020 an increase of the impact of Boko Haram by 30%. And this was systematic. We have seen 2 phases of this evolution. In the beginning of 2019, we have seen a concentration of the Boko Haram attacks on security forces, basically pushing them back into what is called in Nigeria, and especially in the northeast of Nigeria, super camps. It's a little bit a phenomenon that we have seen before, both in Afghanistan, Iraq, or other places where foreign interventions try to restore peace and stability. It is easy to have a military success, but it is much more difficult to also maintain this military success and control the terrain and control the situation. And that's exactly what happened in Nigeria in 2019. So the defense forces basically left the terrain to Boko Haram. Once they started to regroup in super camps operating out of there, they were not so effective in the terrain anymore. And this is in a second phase where Boko Haram started to again harass and attack the local population. And then we saw an increase of those attacks, of course, culminating again a couple of weeks or about a month ago in the killing of more than 100 people in northeast Nigeria. So clearly what we need to understand there is that you need to also back up your military success with continued efforts, both in counterterrorism, but also in anti-terrorism. And if you do not take away the socio-economic factors that would lead to the use of extreme violence, then automatically, once your pressure on those terrorist groups would disappear, we will see, of course, an eruption again of the impact of terrorism in the affected zones. This is something that I'm telling the audience every year. So for the 8th year now, we see that more than 95% of all casualties, I would say, from terrorism fall in an environment or in a country that is already involved in some form of conflict. This conflict can be war. This conflict can also be minor armed conflict. And you will see that the vast majority, 96% of all casualties who fell, I would say, under the impact of terrorism last year, fell in a country that was affected by conflict, and less than 500 in a country that was not affected by conflict. So what we see there is that for many, many groups, for many, many non-state actors, the act of terrorism, according to the definition, is just a technique and procedure used in a larger, I would say, insurrection environment and combat. So this is the evolution distribution of the impact of terrorism over different regions. So the 3 regions most impacted, and that for about 20 years now, would be the MENA region, so Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, of course, with a concentration on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can clearly see the impact of the Islamic State between, I would say here, 2012, 13, 14, and then I would say plateau until 16, 17. But after that, and after the military successes against the Islamic State, a steep decrease of this impact. On the other hand, other regions such as South Asia, with Pakistan, with Afghanistan now for the 2nd year in a row, #1 on the terrorism index, with a portion of the casualties of more than 40%, are now the most affected region of the world, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa. And there we now see the shift of the center of gravity of the Islamic State towards this region. So do we see a shifting landscape? I think it is quite obvious. The 2010s have been a decade super impacted by terrorism. So we clearly see this evolution from the 2000s for all the regions impacted, I would say, in the 2010s. I think something we need to understand there is that we saw an increase in those 3 regions, but we saw a decrease in the number of casualties in the rest of the world in the 2010s. So we can ask ourselves, are we going to see a continued trend, a decreasing trend now in the 2020s that will continue after the peak of 2014? Or are we going to see movements like we are already experiencing today in northeastern Nigeria, where, because we did not take away the fertile soil for radicalization and the use of extreme violence, would we witness in the coming years, I would say, a new increase or a new wave of terrorism that could emerge in the 20s? That's the open question. What we clearly see is that 3 regions are most impacted. And please have a look at Sub-Saharan Africa, and the difference between the 2 decades. I think that's one of the most impressive evolutions. So now if we would focus on the Islamic State as such, as I said in one of the main takeaways, less than 1,000 casualties by the core of ISIL last year. So that's the lowest level since its creation. What we also see is that more and more casualties are generated by both the affiliates to the Islamic State, but especially in the provinces and, of course, the African provinces of the Islamic State. As I said before, 27 countries impacted in 2019, which is still in this plateau of high numbers of countries impacted by the Islamic State. Of course, a lot of those attacks generated by inspiration and lone wolf actors. This is a slide that is a little bit away from this pure analysis of the impact of terrorism. And this is, of course, referring to another publication of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and that's the Ecological Threat Register. The Ecological Threat Register is comparing 2 things. It's a focus on the impact of ecological threats, of course, reinforced by climate change, 8 different threats. But we compare this to the level of resilience of countries to absorb those shocks, to absorb those vulnerabilities. And of course, the result of such a register is completely different from an analysis that would only concentrate on the impact. And what do we see there? We have 3 hotspots of ecological threats and potential societal collapse for the next 30 years. The Sahel region is one of the 3 hotspots, with another hotspot low at a more, I would say, a southern part of Africa, reaching from Angola to Mozambique and Madagascar, and a third one that would really reach out over Central Asia to South Asia, starting in the Middle East. But the Sahel region is one of the hotspots for the ecological threat register. So clearly what we see there is that terrorism as such is a form of violence, maybe a crystallization of other forms of violence in areas of the world where multiple strategic factors influencing peace and security are impacting at the same time. So the solution to all those problems needs to be systemic, because the causes of all those problems are systemic too. So maybe of less interest for the Sahel region, but it needs to be understood also in a more global approach. This is the right of far-right terrorism and political violence. And I think that this week we had a very good example of what we mean by this. What we see in the figures is that political motives are basically creating a large number of attacks or a large number of incidents than religious motives. But on the other hand, we see that religious motives create more casualties than political motives also, especially when it comes to the West, and we make the difference between political motivation and religious motivation. When we look at the West, because it's a Western problem, we need to face the reality there. We clearly see this influx starting in 2010-11, especially with the Anders Breivik attack in Norway that was unfortunately successful, with almost 80 people killed in one day. And what we see after that, we see that a lot of the perpetrators of the terrorist attacks after Anders Breivik just base their philosophy, base their ideology, base the narrative on the manifest produced by Anders Breivik. That was, of course, a very good manifest because it was encompassing all those far-right and extremist ideas of far-right and white supremacist movements. And of course, this evolution, 250% increase over the past 5 years. When we look at the incidents, we see a concentration, a majority of the incidents in the United States and then other Western European countries. It is a little bit different for the number of deaths. Clearly, a majority still in the United States, but that's linked to the number of incidents also. But what we do see is, of course, these very successful, unfortunately successful attacks in Norway and in New Zealand over the past years. Now, this is maybe something that can explain what we have seen this week. This is a poll that has been organized over the past 3 years, starting in November 2017, reaching out to November 2019, and of course, then you see the steep evolution in the past year. So this is a question that has been asked to both Democrats and Republicans in the United States, and the question was, do you feel that violence is at least partially justified in advancing political goals? And I would say that the level of 8% in November 2017 is, I guess, a level that you could find back in a lot of different countries, because you will always find this small minority who think that it is possible. A normal evolution, given the political situation in the United States over the past 2 years, between November 17 and November 19, but then the steep increase in this poll during the campaign leading to the US elections. And I would be really wondering what the figures would be now in January 2021 after the election. So clearly we see there a shift toward the acceptance for the use of violence to attain a political goal, which is, I think, at the basis of the definition of terrorism. And therefore, what happened this week has been defined, especially by the media in the United States, as domestic terrorism. What we have seen linked to this evolution of far-right terrorism or destabilization of some Western societies, we have seen more of a systemic development where we saw a decrease in all those different pillars. We see that the midfield has been deserted. Fractionalized elites are really fighting each other, or at least confronting each other from the extremes. The extremes, this is where it all happens, not in the midfield anymore. Press freedom, quality of information, I guess we all agree that we show a decrease there. And group grievances are really coming at the heart of each debate and flaming basically the debates as we know them today. So when it comes about a systemic approach to terrorism, I think, and this is one of my last slides, what you need to do or the actions that you need to concentrate in a systemic way would be on those three pillars. Basically, cut the funding of these international terrorist groups. And when you would look at EU, I mean, I'm based in Brussels, so if you look at the EU policy in this field, you will see that the two main policies of the EU in the past 5 years would focus on funding of terrorist organizations and also money laundering of those same organizations. When it comes to the media, that's a double approach. Of course, access of those international terrorist groups to media, especially social media, I would say, let's call it cyber terrorism. Everything is done in the virtual world except the final attack, I would say. All the rest, recruitment, training, radicalization, logistics, that's financing, that's all done on social media in the virtual world. But also the impact that is created by international media after attacks, basically free publicity for international terrorist groups. And of course, also distorted publicity given by international media with a larger focus on what's happening in the Western world. Basically, the less impacted part of the world received a large portion of the attention, and there where the largest impact of terrorism is recorded, we don't really hear international media, or we don't really see international media putting the focus on those regions most impacted. Finally, as a more measure of an anti-terrorism, and that's linked to what I explained about Nigeria, you need to make sure that you take away the fertile soil for those international terrorist groups to recruit and radicalize. This is where we are a little bit afraid today that COVID-19, and especially the impact of the economic crisis generated by the pandemic, will push more and more people to the side of society, to the margins of society, where they become really easy prey to recruiters and radicalizers. That's what we are afraid of, both in, I would say, Western society, but also in the global society, where we clearly see more discrimination and more alienation of some parts of society. And of course, becoming then a more easy prey for recruitment and radicalization. At least in my country, Christmas is just over, but still this is a good opportunity if you would like to make a gift to a person you love or your person you have an esteem for. So our founder and executive chairman, Steve Killelea, produced the history of the Institute for Economics and Peace, but also described his path over the past 20 years in the study of peace and the research and the creation of a more peaceful world in a systemic way. So this is in his book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, that you can, of course, try to achieve. And finally, everything that I spoke of today is available. So the full PDF, a map, interactive map that you can use and click and access the data with on our website, visionofhumanity.org. And you can also follow the Institute for Economics and Peace on all major social media. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the other panelists and the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge, for setting the scene with such an insightful presentation about terrorism and the latest trends all around the world. Up next, we have Dr. Pierre Englebert. He is the H. Russell Smith Professor of International Relations, Pomona College, and Senior Fellow at the Africa Center at the Council. He will be discussing today local conditions and state capacity in the Sahel region. Dr. Englebert has an extensive background in academia, having authored 5 books, several book chapters, and over 20 articles in peer-reviewed journals. He has also conducted field research all across Africa. And before entering academia, Dr. Englebert worked at the World Bank, focusing on the World Development Report and the West Africa region. He also worked at the Belgium Royal Military Academy, where he was a research assistant in the Department of Economics, Management, and Leadership. And as a leading expert in African politics and development, Dr. Englebert has consulted for the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Bank, the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, the US Department of State, and the US Department of Defense. Dr. Engelbert has worked on and studied African politics and development since 1983, and he earned his PhD in political economy from the University of Southern California in 1998. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Engelbert. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Serge, for that very insightful presentation. This is really a remarkable report, the report on global terrorism that you just released, and I learned a lot from it, and I highly recommend it. And if you open that report, the first thing you'll notice there's a map at the beginning, which shows the distribution of global terrorism by countries. And if you focus on the Sahel, you'll find that it's far from a homogeneous region. In fact, you'll see that Mali and Burkina are deep red, which is high incidence, and then you have Niger, which is more peach, a little less, and then you see Mauritania is light blue, which is almost no incidence at all. And so what I'd like to focus on today in my brief remarks is what might explain these variations in the spread of terror in that region. The whole region is very similar in some ways. It's all these countries are fairly poor, and all of them are dealing with significant issues of state capacity. So we can really wonder where that difference comes from. And Mali and Burkina are really on the catastrophic end of the range. Burkina more recently, it's only after 2015 that things really flare up in Burkina. Mali since 2011, really after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. But in both Mali and Burkina, you have a lot of domestic dimensions of terror. Niger is less than these two countries, but still fairly high. But a lot of the terror in Niger really spills over from Nigeria. The Boko Haram is concentrated in northern Nigeria. And so quite a few activities affect the Hausa region, which is in the south of Niger by the region. So to some extent, the situation in Niger domestically is better than the data suggests. So what I'd like to focus on is maybe wonder with you, what might be local conditions, what might be local factors that can help explain these variations. And I think that the thing we need to focus on most to begin with are really the conditions in the specific countries in terms of where the violence is taking place and what kind of a social contract, what kind of a foundations of the state we have in each of these countries. And how does the violence and the regional distribution of the violence affect or not the root foundations of the regime, if you will. As Serge was mentioning earlier, you have this, he mentioned the Fulanis in Nigeria. Terrorism in the Sahel, and I imagine elsewhere, does not happen in a vacuum. It overlaps local conflicts, and it's often it instrumentalizes local conflicts. So in the Sahel, you have significant issues among communities that you might define on ethnic terms, or there might be sometimes other dimensions to think of them. But there is potential for violent conflict among local communities over issues of access to land, and the issue of ecological deterioration is crucial here. You have populations who are herders, who like to go around semi-nomadic lifestyles with their cattle, others who are farmers. And it's always been the case that these populations are into a certain degree of conflict because they make differential uses of the environment. But as the climate changes and water becomes scarcer, then these conflicts become more pronounced. And then they can easily be instrumentalized by outside actors or by rogue local actors who can try to benefit from that to advance their own political entrepreneurship. And so communities fight over land, communities fight over access to state resources. The possibility of having schools, the possibility of having some basic infrastructures like wells and roads, etc. Now, how does that affect the state? The state will respond differently if its core interests are affected or not. So you look at Mali. Mali is really the worst case scenario. Mali is the lack of ownership of the crisis by the Malian authorities is quite telling. I spent some time in Mali the last few years, and I'm always struck in how in Bamako, the capital, the people seem to live a little bit like they're in Versailles while Paris is burning, and but it's not really affecting us directly, right? And so where is the violence taking place? It's really in the north, where you have Tuareg and Arab population, and more in the center, with the Massina Liberation Front, where you have Fulani population. And if you look at historically the core constituents of Mali, Mali is really historically a Bambara Mande state that really has very, very long lasting, more than 1,000 years of roots in history. And these populations have always been peripheral and have suffered from really failed integration in the Malian post-colonial project. And to some extent, Malian authorities, Malian political elites can afford to live with this peripheral violence among communities that are not at the core of the state. Similarly, in terms of resource, Mali has very few resources, and you do have the Niger Delta in the north and the center around Timbuktu, where there is significant agricultural resource and potential for cotton. It's still limited compared to other things. And gold is the #1 export, and gold mines are mostly focused, concentrated in the south. So here too, if you will, at its own level, which is kind of weak, Mali is able to survive, and the regime is able to reproduce itself despite the violence. And I think that explains partly its lack of strong security response. Same thing in Burkina. In Burkina, the violence is in the north, where you have Fulani populations also, and in the east, where you have Gourmanche population. Both of these groups are fairly unintegrated. Historically, the Fulani have always been on the losing end of the social contract. Burkina is a majority Mossi country. About 50–55% of the country are from the ethnic group, the Mossi, who are really centered in Ouagadougou, the capital. And here too, I was just there last year, you get the sense that, if the Mossis are not really directly affected, will the state respond as vigorously as it could otherwise? In Burkina, there's some additional issues with the change of regime that took place in 2014, which has weakened security forces, and I'll come back to that. But in both Mali and Burkina, the worst case scenarios in the Sahel, you see that who is at the core of the state is not on the front line of the violence and paying a very high price. And so you can't think of these states in homogeneous terms. You have to think of these states as like anywhere else, groups that compete for influence, for resources, and for power. Now compare that with Niger, which has done a lot better. In Niger, the violence is actually more in the south because a lot of it comes from Boko Haram. And there you have Hausa and Zarma population, who are the core of the Niger state. So it's very different in terms of lineup as it is next door. Now, there used to be some violence more with the Tuaregs in the north in 2011 when things collapsed in Libya. But most of these Tuaregs then moved from Libya and got on their way to Mali and largely bypassed Niger. And that's partly because in Niger, the Tuaregs have been much better integrated. There was some insurgency for secessions in the 1990s, but Niger addressed that with its constitution, its decentralization. And in fact, the prime minister in Niger is Tuareg, and they've had a much better policy of bringing the Tuaregs into the social contract. And so the violence deals with regions that are really at the core of the Niger polity, and that has led to a stronger response. I don't want to overplay that because Niger still has significant issues, and the military is corrupt, and it's not really a very, very strong state. But there is a significant. If you look at the GTI, the Global Terrorism Index data, I looked at the numbers since 2011 and I did a simple statistical t-test. There's a statistically significant difference between Niger and Mali and Burkina in terms of the incidents. Okay, so I just want to stress that we have to put things in context, right? The other dimension is that capacity, and I won't take much more time, but capacity differs, even though they're all very weak countries. They don't have the same capacity. And here Mauritania can help us make sense of things. Mauritania has very low numbers. Although if you look at, earlier, 2011, a little bit before that, there were some incidents in Mauritania, but it responded much more strongly. What you observe is that Mauritania has very, very small population, a couple of million, compared to the other ones that are in the 20 million, for example. And so it also has some significant mineral resource, bauxite. And so the state's resource per capita are much higher in Mauritania. Even though it's a weak country, the government in Mauritania has about $400 per capita in domestic revenue versus about 100 in Mali and something like 80 in Burkina Faso. That makes a big difference. What kind of surplus you can extract to defend yourself. You're much more likely to take ownership if you have these kind of resources. And Mauritania has deployed these resources in the security sector. On top of that, Mauritania is an Islamic republic, and that has allowed them to control their religious authorities much better than they do in Mali and Burkina, where you have rogue imams and people much more likely to be influenced by Salafist and Wahhabi outside forces. Not as much in Mauritania, where the state very much is in charge of the religion. And then you have a very different ethnic makeup in Mauritania, where you have, the white Moors, the black Moors, and then the more traditional Sub-Saharan black population that don't have a very regional distribution, unlike in the other countries. So you don't have the same dimension of the grievance of one community that can be instrumentalized with regional breakdown. If you will. Finally, my last point is that foreign intervention varies across the region. And this is kind of a paradoxical insight, but the one country where there's the most intervention against terrorism is Mali. And in Mali, of course, you have, Operation Barkhane is everywhere, but it used to be Serval, used to be based in Mali. And it's really focused largely on northern Mali. And then you have MINUSMA, which is not against terrorism, but de facto, of course, is there as a defense for the state. And then you have, the European Union as a training, a capacity building force, and then you have G5. You have an increasing number of outside actors. These actors, as Serge was saying, they cannot really address the root cause, and so they kind of they act like a band-aid. But what they also do, they exonerate the state. If you're in Bamako, you are not directly threatened because you do have that wall there protecting you. And I think it de-responsibilizes Malian authorities and leads them to fail to take action in that way. So to conclude, I think that fighting terrorism the terrorism in the Sahel is very significant. The extent to which things have collapsed over the last few years is stunning. I've been going to the Sahel since the early 80s when I was myself a student, and I would travel all over that region by myself with absolutely no concern. Now, most of that is off limits. It's really quite dramatic to see the extent to which it has deteriorated. But it's not a security problem to begin with. It's a security consequence, if you will. And so we need to understand local violent logics, not just terrorism. We need to go back to the domestic, local issues and help local communities address these. And that includes finding ways to do local conflict resolution, mediation among communities and different claims, and building on local legitimacy, the authority of chiefs, the authority of certain religious leaders. And then we have to understand the rationality of governments. Outsiders work with African governments, and there's always that notion that, oh, we all have the same goal, but African governments, like governments anywhere else, have goals that are largely to maximize their own utility, to maximize their access to resources, to maximize their power. And that sometimes can accommodate itself of a certain degree of terror. And so one has to build that into the model. And I'll leave it at that, and I'm glad to answer any question later, but I don't want to monopolize too much time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Englebert, for providing such an insightful presentation, also more focused on the Sahel region, and for providing more insights into it, even from providing approaches and the landscape at the moment. Thank you very much for that. Next, we will have Dr. Red Rafi. He's a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he's focusing on terrorism, security, and East Asia studies. His area of expertise covers Afro-Asian affairs, strategic and security studies, terrorism, extremism, and the radicalization, mainly from the view of criminal, legal, and forensic psychology. Currently, Dr. Rezrazi is also the executive director of the Moroccan Observatory on Extremism and Violence, and also the director of the African Center for Asian Studies. In 2017, he was appointed a coordinator of the Over China-Morocco Research Group and a member of the advisory board of the Euro-African Studies Institute at the Hanyang University of Seoul in South Korea. Moreover, he has served as a distinguished professor in the University of Mohammed VI Rabat, the School of Law of Sapporo Gakuen University, and the Institute of International Relations in Hagoromo University in Osaka, Japan, as well as a visiting fellow at the Princeton University. Dr. Rezrazi earned his PhD in Regional and International Affairs from the University of Tokyo in 1998, and later a doctorate from the University of Mohammed V on the psychological dynamism of suicide bombers in 2014. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Rajazi. It is a pleasure to have you in the panel, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria, for leading this very fruitful and insightful discussion. Thank you, Serge, for the report first, and also for your constructive remarks that you have provided at the beginning of this session. Pierre, for your insightful and deep academically established remarks. So on my side, I would like to share with you some insight related to, well, the issue, topic, subject of today. I mean, looking a little bit on the Sahel issue. I'm not sure if you are looking to the slides. I want to be sure, is it? Can you see my slides, please? Okay, great. So basically, I would like to just to share with you some works we are doing here, and just following those new dynamics that take place not only in the Sahel but also in North Africa. And basically, we have since 2018, 2021, we have how we say identified 5 main dynamics. The first one is the strong tendency of a large number of terrorist groups and organizations such Boko Haram, Jama'at Nusrat Islam wal Muslimin, and others, who are consolidating their rhetorics and jihadist narrative by trying to make it much more African, taking, I mean, their, if you would like, providing a very authentic narratives and searching for local references component. Sometimes we call it Africanization of the narratives, and this was very was impacting strongly their engagement with I mean the population. The second tendency we have identified is also this capacity to look for a social and ethnic fabric, and to instead of working with this dichotomy of excluding the mass within doctrinal dichotomy. They are, I mean, we are facing today in or we are experiencing in the Sahel how these groups today are they are trying to empower their presence by negotiating, protecting, protesting, and taking, I mean, part for the sake of the population. And of course, within not only Mali, but also we can see that in Burkina Faso, Mozambique, and also in other countries in the Sub-Saharan Africa. And this make it quite difficult with the weak regimes that we do have in the region. Third, I mean, how we say, trend or change, or let's say fear, is this capacity of those groups today, some of them mainly, who were able to identify themselves within territoriality in remote area. They are sometimes trying to go forward a separatist how we say request, and this can also deepen the fragility of the state, maybe also mainly in some countries who are not able to control their territories and borders. So beside that, we do have another, if you wish, we have another, well, we have the electoral episodes. I will not talk about it. I guess everybody do know that since 2018, and it is still affecting also the management of those threats. But there is a new emerging phenomena today, not only in the Sahel, but also in North Africa, this epidemic or this contagion of terrorist violent behavior which is in interference with criminal phenomena. So we have seen how some groups today, they are learning or they are inspiring from criminal performance, and vice versa. We have also some criminal groups who learned also from the performance of terrorist groups. And this is quite a complicated issue today. Beside that, we do have some, I talked about the narrative, but let me just stress two changes that have been identified in the construction of terrorist groups now, or violent extremist groups. They emphasize the ethnicity, and also they are using the presence of foreign forces in the region. So those two elements seems to be quite new drivers to bring the population much more in sympathy with some groups. Other concern could be also related, and this is a very local discussion we do have here. So basically, we are trying to find another concept that can complete or go with interference with FTF, foreign terrorist fighters, because sometimes it doesn't fit well, since we are talking about our own citizen who left to Syria and Iraq, and we have suggested in some papers to also use the ATF, affiliated terrorist fighters, which is wider, and avoid this exclusion. Another alarming indicators is this redeployment or turning the battle in cyberspace. Just in my country, I guess that law enforcement agencies was able to to arrest some leading figures working online, and the numbers are very significant here, because we have moved from 83 leading activists online in 2016 to 193 to 408 in 2020. So this movement seems to be also quite significant to observe and to take into consideration. There is some issues that also, besides numbers, besides benchmarking, are a subject of discussion and debate, not only in North Africa but in Sahel. The first one is we still have a lot of things to do in the area of cooperation, security cooperation between different security agencies. So the assessment is very low in that sense. The second is the accountable countries. Unfortunately, sometimes they are less appreciated than silent countries. And here I am talking about the accountability to provide numbers and information. So we are around in our area this slogan, this funny slogan that no news is good news. So sometimes those who are silent countries, they are less represented in reports, and those who are providing more information, sometimes they are affected in in the benchmarking. And I'm talking about some European reports that have been manifesting in that way. So maybe this requires another way to exchange, to deliberate within expert and professional in the future. And I found personally that the Global Terrorism Index is a very good tool to normalize, to harmonize criteria. I found it at least very neutral, very objective, using different indicators, and this is quite good news, at least for both professional and researcher. Before I finish, just I would like also to, if you don't mind, just maybe in the I do know that there is so many data banks that we are using, database like START and others, but I was looking to some, well, informations before 2005. I guess that also maybe we need to get in discussion with those data banks, because there is some small mistakes that has been not yet corrected. And also there is, and I would like to hear from my colleagues. We have another problem facing us in the, how we say, collecting information is those informations coming from terrorist groups themselves. And I have an example. If you are looking to the newspaper Naba of ISIS, you will find that the number of casualties and attack is more than double that we do know and what was diffused by public media. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rafi, for your presentation. It was very helpful also to hear more about terrorism in the Sahel region and the dynamics that have been unfolding during this period. So thank you very much for that. And on this note, I would also like to thank again all the speakers for your presentations, which were very interesting and very insightful. I'm sure it was very, very, very interesting and educative for our audience. And now I would like to open the Q&A session. And while we wait a few more moments to let our audience ask more questions to the panelists, I would like to begin with one question that will perhaps link terrorism and state capacities, and at the same time, one future challenge will be the environment. So according to the Ecological Threat Register, the Sahel region is at risk of ecological threats, and at the same time, it already has low levels of societal resilience. So how do you see the threat of ecological threats and more their consequent threats, such as food insecurity and forced displacement and so on, affecting the region, and moreover, impulsing perhaps terrorism? How do you see terrorism being impacted by this? Perhaps for this first round, we can follow the same order that we followed during the presentation. So perhaps we can begin with Serge, followed by Dr. Engelbert, and finally with Dr. Refrafi. Serge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much to my two colleagues in the panels for the kind words to these colleagues and peace and the GTI, but definitely also for their amazing presentation. And I also learned a lot from both of you. Something that came to my mind through your presentation that is also linked to your question, Maria, is the fact that not only the Islamic State shifted the center of gravity to Sub-Saharan Africa, but we saw also a better organization of the affiliates in those provinces in Sub-Saharan Africa. We noticed exchange of fighters between different areas where terrorism is used at the moment, really between Mali or Burkina Faso down to Nigeria and the other way around. So we clearly saw a stronger coordination and communication within this African or Sub-Saharan African nexus of terrorism. What we have seen in the past years, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, is terrorism being the crystallization of other forms of violence. And most of the groups that are now, I would say, national or international terrorist groups, you will see that a lot of them also started with other forms of violence that could be related to access to resources. So we clearly see that access to resources, and the Fulanis are a very good example for that. Access to resources generates some form of violence. Those forms of violence can just evolve and crystallize or transform into terrorism at some point. Of course, with recuperation of affiliates of larger international groups that will take this presence of violence to inject, of course, their ideology and to generate more chaos. What we see is that with the ecological threat register, of course, access to resources is going to become much more of a problem. The impact of natural disasters is definitely going to be a large problem in the next 30 years. But one of the 8 ecological threats, of one of the 8 indicators there, is demography. What we will see in the coming 30 years in large portions of Africa, but definitely in the Sahel, is a multiplication of the population in the next 30 years. A lot about, I think it's about close to 2017 or 18, will double the population. In the case of Niger, it's time 270%. So almost triple the population in the next 30 years. And I think this is going to generate both a faster depletion of the available resources, but also this is going to generate a youth bulk as we have never seen before. And this is going to create even more potential for violence and potential for conflict. So clearly, and having an impact also on the resilience of the countries at risk, but also on the survival, on the social survival, systemic survival of those countries. At a certain moment of time, the pressure of those different strategic factors influencing peace and security is going to become so strong on these social systems that they will just collapse. And we already see this in the evolution of violence, and definitely of terrorism also, where today, and especially in the past 10 years, the Global Peace Index has seen a decrease of peacefulness throughout the world by more than 2.5%, driven by conflict. And those conflicts, and we have seen that the driver for terrorism is conflict, those conflicts now are featuring more and more non-state actors facing non-state actors in environments where state actors do not have the monopoly of violence anymore. So clearly, I would say an interconnection of very smaller storms influencing peace and security that are going to lead to eventually a superstorm that is going to lead to social collapse and even more violence in the future. Thank you.
So I'll just go ahead then, right? It's a fascinating question. There's no doubt that there's tremendous ecological fragility in the Sahel. And of course, one cannot help but see some degree of connection with the violence. But if you look back in the longer term perspective, this is nothing new. The Sahel had droughts in the 1970s. There was droughts in the 1980s, and you didn't have massive violence back then. So there's not a necessary causal relation between these two things. You have a combination of factors. So certainly, there's a push from outside actors, right? So there's no doubt that Algeria pushed down some of its terrorist problem to Mali, and then there's the breakdown in Libya triggered violence in the region. The fact that ISIS tried to redeploy after being defeated in Syria contributed to that, and then you have the contagion from Nigeria into the Sahel. So you have those dimensions, but then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a degree of instrumentalization. But how is that possible? Because by itself, in and of itself, the ecological dimension doesn't have to lead to violence. And I think what we see, in addition to the outside actors, one of the crucial spark here is the increased inability of several Sahelian states to provide basic governance and to generate sufficient trust in their institutions. If you look at Mali, for example, I just saw a survey maybe a few weeks ago. The level of trust in the government was around 30% versus 70% trust in traditional chiefs and 80% trust in religious leaders. So there's an issue here of states that have become increasingly alienated from their population. I think largely because they are very irresponsible and largely because they are focused on their reproduction as a political elite and focused on their capital city. What needs to happen here is a reform of the states of the Sahel, building upon local roots of legitimacy. Instead of just having the kind of decentralization policy that's just the top down, like in Mali, they had decentralization, but essentially then you have these communes. And when you go to the countryside, I did some work in the Sikassa region a few years ago, and right next to Burkina and Côte d'Ivoire in the south of Mali. And I went to villages, and the people in the villages, you have the chiefs and the local council. And they say, you know what, we're supposed to be decentralized, and there's a commune here, and there's a mayor who controls, about 50 villages. We never see him unless it's tax time. He comes and he collects taxes once a year. But this is still this decentralized mayor is still seen as the as Bamako, as the state coming down to do what? To extract resources from local population, not to address their issues. But we have structures there. In that village, there was a council of elders. There were people have been able to govern themselves historically, but that is giving really short shrift in the post-colonial environment. I think we need to go back to these local legitimate institutions and help people develop that capacity to adjudicate their local disputes and to resolve conflict. And there is a lot of local social capital and local legitimacy. But the focus on the top of the state has prevented us from really activating that. And I think the reform of the state in the Sahel is a crucial step towards long-term solution. Thank you.
My side, I guess that I'm in the same line of Pierre, because I don't find this relationship, automatic relationship between the, how we say, ecological degradation and terrorist groups, unless if we are looking to two elements, in my sense. The first one, if we are looking to the ideology of violent extremist groups as an ideology that does not adapt the appropriation of territory, does not believe on, how we say, on the belonging to the nation, maybe it might affect some parts, but also from the state level sometimes, and we have seen that in Mali for a few years, how the central government has neglected some area which were evaluated, controlled by Boko Haram and other groups, and they did not include them in their development plan. So this also might affect. The third one, of course, is the the forced human mobility that we have seen, for instance, in Burkina Faso. So also that can be another element that can, how we say, increase the degradation of the ecological ecosystem.
Thank you very much to all of you. Giving the time, I will ask another question to which you can all reply and add certain elements. So the question will be, what link do you make between the proliferation of terrorist networks and demographic development in sub-Saharan countries? Perhaps we can begin with Dr. Engelbert.
Sorry, I think I'll pass because it's not my specialty directly. So I can come to this discussion offering a perspective on Sahelian politics, but I don't know enough about theories of terrorism and about the connection. There's no doubt, as Serge was mentioning earlier, that all over Africa, the demographic pressure is tremendous, and it can be both a blessing and of course, it's very scary to think of all these young people coming, maturing and not having an economy that can absorb them, right? So there's very little formal employment, there's very little manufacturing and industry. And so outside of living in the rural areas and working in farming, the service industry is very limited to the state. And so a lot of people really have a hard time imagining what their future could be. So for example, I know a family in Ouagadougou. I know them well, I've known them for many years. And they have a son who I knew when he was born, and now he's in university, Ouagadougou, and he's going on his 8th year there because it's impossible to actually be able to find classes. They cancel classes, they cancel years, they can't accommodate everybody. And so essentially most students do in 6 to 8 years what they would be expected to do in 4. And then there really is nothing at the end of that. So he's there and sitting, in his mid-20s, living at home and with no job. And then he goes out into the market in the morning and see if he can find little things here and there. And he's somebody with a decent university education. And essentially we have this impossibility to become an adult, to develop sufficient resource to think of, marrying, starting a family, having a house. And that certainly, I can imagine, creates tremendous grievance and pent-up expectations. Now, I can imagine that what this could do to violence, but that's not my specialty. So I just give you that anecdote to stress how there's an emotional dimension there that I can certainly relate to, but I can't really go much beyond that. I apologize.
Thank you very much. Serge, would you like to go next?
Yes, of course. Well, I think it's not your specialty, Pierre, but it was a very good answer. I would maybe a bit mitigate a bit or complement what you just said. I wrote down education and training because you gave an example of somebody that was able to receive an education, still not able to access the job market or to develop a decent life. And that's at the heart of what my institute is doing, is trying to imagine or develop an environment in which everybody can really flourish and develop its full potential. So I guess education and training will be a problem. We work together with UNFPA, so the Population Fund for Western Africa, and we did research on the Sahel region and really looking at the three cases, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And clearly you see today that it's almost unbearable, that you cannot even construct enough schools or have enough professors or teachers to put in those schools in front of this large youth bulge that is created. And so today we are, or this region or those countries are already facing such issues, problems, and challenges in making sure that they can accommodate I would say the aspirations of the youth. So just imagine when you're going to double or triple that in the next 30 years. Together with resources that will start to deplete or to which the access will be much more difficult. Combined with this, what we discussed in the previous question, a lack of resilience and the lack of capabilities or of capacities of the states to absorb these type of risks. So one can just imagine how this is going to deteriorate in the coming years, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rajasi, would you like to add anything?
Well, very shortly, because if you continue asking those specific questions, I will fail in the exam, definitely. But I guess the issue of demography in that debate has to do also with the push factors, because it or it has strong interference with the sustainable development goals. So if those countries are not able, of course, to maintain their development programs, they are not able to provide or to increase a good environment for job market for the youth. Definitely this demographic changes is affecting, I mean, of course, how we say, the increasing of not only terrorist threat but other threats. In addition, there is some other small elements related to the relation between the South and the North, those tough policies related to migration, so some inaccurate new systems related to ODA. So it's a package that maybe economists can provide a good answer, but definitely I guess that demography also is another element to take into strategic analysis of those non-conventional threats.
Thank you very much for all your answers. And now I would like to move on to the closing remarks. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to ask specific questions to each of you, but I have certain elements that perhaps I can ask from the questions that we have received, and you can incorporate into your closing remarks. So a few of the questions that we received included from if you would see any shift from the Trump to the Biden administration having a direct impact in the Sahel. Another question that perhaps would interest Dr. Engelbert would be that based on his presentation about cross-border challenges, would you think that a regional response will be the only option? And how would you think that individual countries using positive peace will be effective to address these challenges? And also another question that is more open about terrorism is that, would you say that terrorism is the consequence of failed integration? These are a few of the questions that we have received, and perhaps you would like to add some elements from these questions into your closing remarks. And now I would like to shift again the order and begin perhaps with Dr. Restrasi, followed by Dr. Engelbert, and finalize with Mr. Schwaben.
Well, thank you very much. I guess personally, I am much more concerned, well, about the security cooperation, which is really a serious problem today in Africa. And I guess that we are still affected by those political standards that connect countries, and maybe we need a new doctrine, maybe we need a para-diplomatic type of security cooperation, whether countries are good in their neighborhood. Maybe we need to create new ties. Unfortunately, we don't have any international agency that work on the issue of international security, international cooperation. This is a dream maybe, but I guess from our side as scholars, as researchers, we can also investigate on the issue, but also we can make an advocacy that countries should work all together. This is very important. The second, and it has to do with something, even if we are looking to the Western support, for instance, I guess there is some issues that should be fixed. If you take to some Western countries come in, I'm not talking about the military presence, but also in terms of intelligence, you will find that those skills coming from Europe, they are good in urban terrorism, and they should adapt also their skills to remote area terrorism, territorial terrorism. Sometimes there is a confusion between strategic intelligence and operational intelligence, and that's why we can see some less successful stories, and we don't know why it doesn't work. Maybe we need also, as a scholar, to focus on those areas, and maybe to assess the professionals' performance in the field. Well, in terms of, for me, I am much more working on the psychological drivers that make youth quite open or weak to such recruitments, and I guess this area also requires quite strong efforts to be done, because if you are looking to the efforts done by UN, by GZTF and others, they were able to produce so many memorandums to came to a concession in different area, except this area of the psychological supervising, the psychological rehabilitation of former offenders, for instance. So I guess there is a lot of things to do in this part related to preventing or prevention from violent extremism at large.
So my concluding remarks would be that the core issue in the Sahel is the state, and the state is the root of the problem. And I think that the Sahelian states, and it's true in other parts of Africa too, not everywhere, but certainly it's an issue. The failure of post-colonial states in Africa to develop genuine roots, to invent ways to function that are compatible with their environment, their demographic, their social, their historical resource environment. The fact that there's always this attempt to replicate the European sovereign territorial state, right? So Mali essentially tries to be France in the middle of the desert, right? This is not realistic. Mali doesn't have the resources to do that. Mali doesn't have the population. The territory is too prohibitive. but there's never a questioning like what kind of state can we be? And it's a shame because Mali was a state for a long time, way before the French showed up, and Mali knew how to function its environment. And what is now considered like criminal networks of trafficking that used to be international trade, and it was centralized, it was formalized into the state. And I think African states in the Sahel need to reinvent themselves in a way shed more of that legacy of the post-colony and build on their intrinsic domestic strength that they do have. Those are countries that were able to govern themselves, situation, populations, societies that can govern themselves. And so I do think, and this addressed one of your question, that there is a regional response that is needed there. And I think that the future of these states in finding ways to blend into something larger where they can essentially pool resources, where they can both at the global level find something that's more like a type of federation, and at the local level build on the real local institution, and so dilute themselves, if you will. If you look at Mali, historically, the Mali kingdom, it was kind of an empire, an imperial system, where you had kind of a loose association of different authorities functioning together. And I think that there's room for such a model in such a difficult environment as the Sahel, where you don't have the population density and the easy access to resources that are at the root of state building in general, right? And so you need to adapt. The state is something that comes out of a specific environment, and the sovereign territorial state rose in Europe at a moment with population density and the spread of international trade. And then it kind of exported itself or metastasized through colonization. But it's not really a very well suited political system for many regions, particularly the Sahel. And the terrorists and other groups are making challenge. They're not just undermining the state, they are offering alternatives. Boko Haram is, the book is forbidden, Western education is forbidden. It is a rejection of the post-colonial model. And if you're Nigerian, there's some good grounds to reject that, especially if you know the Nigeria. The system hasn't done that much for you. And before that, in that region, you had caliphates, the Kano, the Sokoto caliphates that were somewhat functional political systems based on Sharia. And there's legitimacy to that. So you have to engage with that as opposed to criminalizing it. So that would be my kind of overall conclusion. There's a question about Biden. I'm reaching out to you here from the U.S. And as you know, we're going through a very difficult transition, as Serge was saying, with around significant blend of terrorism. We are lucky that our terrorists are so moronic that when they actually break into parliament, they just take selfies as opposed to taking hostages, but things could have been a lot worse. I don't know what's gonna happen with this new administration. All I can say is that you cannot overestimate US capacity anymore. I think we are much weaker than we used to be in terms of projecting power. And the Sahel is not a high priority. Africa usually is not. Under Trump, it was all about, how do we compete with the Chinese in Africa? I assume that will be toned down a little bit. There's a disengagement from the Sahel. The US has pulled troops out of Niger. There were 800 at some point, now we're down to 400. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because, as I said earlier, the security approach is not really the right thing to do. But I would not expect too much from either administration right now. I think this is not a high priority, and we are much weaker than we're at some point. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
I think it's my turn to provide my closing remarks, Maria. Thank you very much. I think my closing remark would focus on this systemic approach, so basically providing systemic solutions. And there's one of the questions talking about positive peace. I guess this can bring more resilience, and of course, we quantify that. And so high levels of positive peace come with more stability, more resilience, high levels of happiness, well-being, but also economic, social, and governance, and even ecological resilience can be improved through high levels of positive peace. So yes, always. That's the question. So I guess we need to see what's happening in the Sahel and to a larger extent to Sub-Saharan Africa, or to the continent, as multiple risks, multiple actors, multiple stakeholders, and also systemic solutions that need to be brought to those challenges. When it comes to Trump-Biden, I think you're absolutely right, Pierre, to say that this is not a focus for the US, the United States as such, and you clearly see that this is not dancing between the Middle East and pivoting to Southeast Asia. Africa is not in the center of the debate. And I think what might change between Trump and Biden is to see the focus that has been put on the military, basically taking budget away from the State Department and USAID. You might see a better redistribution to this 3D approach with a better balance between defense, development, and diplomacy. On the other hand, what we expect at the Institute for Economics and Peace is to see the majority, if not all, of our peace indicators to decrease, to be negative, to have a negative influence by COVID-19, but especially by the economic crisis that is linked to the pandemic. And one of the major effects that will have is a reduced budget of ODA, overseas development aid, which would be, of course, a major mistake. But as the only solution is pumping a lot of financial assets into the economies, you will need to make choices. You need to make budget choices. And we are afraid that ODA would be one of the variables that will be used to balance somehow budgets, which I think to the mid and long term will have a catastrophic effect. And to finalize, I think the last question was about terrorism, consequence of a failed integration. I think this is focusing on Western societies. My society is here with the terrorism, also on European soil and in Brussels in March 2016. I think it's a little bit a shortcut to say, failed integration will lead to terrorism, will lead to radicalization. What we have seen is that there is coming from those failed integration. There is a phenomenon that we call born again, because the strongest foreign terrorist fighters, jihadists that left Europe to Syria were either converts, so people who learned a new religion, but only the very extremist fringe of this new religion, or former Muslims that forgot their religions and are born again as extremists in an extremist form of the religion. And this has nothing to do really with a failed integration. And then, of course, we could debate about the term integration. What does that mean? But what we see, and that's something that I spoke about during my presentation, is the work of recruiters do not approach anybody in this society. Recruiters are going to approach those people who felt discrimination, who felt alienation from the society in which they live, and this, of course, in our Western societies, but also in the global society. So that's what we need to be very careful for, is to make sure that we create societies that are equal, equitable, and inclusive also, and that we do not push people to the side of our population, to the margins of our population, where it is easy then for recruiters to do their job and to radicalize. So that's what we need to look at. And there again, COVID-19 and the pandemic, of course, the isolation through COVID-19, but the effects of the pandemic, high levels of unemployment, lower levels of, I would say, happiness. There again, we see a very negative impact on the indicators, and we see more and more potential fringes or potential parts of society really being pushed to the outskirts of society, and therefore creating again a larger fertile ground or a larger potential for recruitment and radicalization. So yeah, really we need to keep an eye on this, and we need to keep an eye to continue to develop our societies, but also the global society, into something that is really equal, equitable, and inclusive. Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much to the other panelists and to the Policy Center of the New South for co-organizing the event.
Thank you very much for all your great presentations, and also for replying to the questions during the Q&A session. Also, thank you very much for joining us today and taking some time to present to our audience. And I would also like to thank our audience for joining, connecting with us through social media, and also for engaging and sending over their questions. I would also like to mention that the webinar will continue to be available in YouTube, in the channel of the Policy Center for the New South. And on that note, I would also like to thank the Policy Center for the New South for coordinating this event. Thank you very much to everyone, and I wish you a great evening and a great weekend. Thanks for joining the webinar, Global Terrorism, a focus on the Sahel region.